Time for your meds, Mr. Kong. The words were a soft ritual, spoken into a silence, so deep it felt like a physical presence in the grand, cold room. Lena held the small paper cup and a glass of water, her movements practiced, economical, honed over 15 years of the same quiet rhythm. She was the ghost in his gilded cage, the keeper of a silence, so profound it had its own gravity. But what she didn't know was that the silence was a shield, and the man she saw as a patient was a king watching his board, waiting for the one move that would change everything. Get ready for an emotional roller coaster, because some secrets don't just break hearts, they shatter worlds. What would you do if the person you've cared for, the one you thought was helpless, was actually the most dangerous person in the room? For Lena, this wasn't a question. It was the start of her day. Every morning at 7 a.m., she would enter Minjun Kang's suite, the air always chilled from the marble floors and the heavily curtained, locked windows that faced the manicured, empty gardens. 15 years. 15 years of bathing, clothing, and feeding a man who hadn't spoken a word or moved a single voluntary muscle since the day she was hired. He was a statue of a man, his handsome face a frozen mask of neutrality, his dark eyes the only part of him that seemed to hold any depth, though they stared straight ahead, seeing nothing. Or so she believed. She was just the nurse, a 35-year-old woman who had long ago accepted her own invisibility to the world. Kind, smart, hardworking. Those were words her mother used to use, but they felt like they belonged to a different person now. Here, she was a function, a pair of hands. The only other person she regularly interacted with was Mr. Cho, the stern, impeccably dressed man who served as Mr. Kang's gatekeeper and handler. He would give her the day's instructions, his words always clipped and formal. The West Wing windows are being cleaned today. Ensure the drapes remain closed, or a delivery is expected at noon. Do not answer the door yourself. He was loyal but conflicted, his gaze always carrying a weight she couldn't decipher. The routine was her safety and her prison. Prepare the food, a specialized liquid diet. Read to him from the newspaper, her voice a low murmur against the oppressive quiet. Reposition him every 2 hours to prevent sores. It was a life measured in small, repetitive tasks. But lately, something was off. A subtle anomaly. Yesterday, the television had been on a financial news channel when she entered. She always left it on a classical music station. She'd chalked it up to a mistake by the night staff, but the feeling lingered, a tiny splinter of unease in the smooth surface of her day. She dismissed it, just as she dismissed the flicker in his eyes when the news anchor mentioned a rival family's corporate takeover. Just a trick of the light. It had to be. The feeling of being watched grew stronger over the next few days. It was a prickling sensation on the back of her neck, a sudden chill in the warm room that made her pause, her hand hovering over Minjun's shoulder. She would scan the opulent suite, her eyes catching on the rows of leather-bound books he would never read, the expensive art on the walls he would never see, the thick Persian rug that muffled all sound. Everything was always in its place, except when it wasn't. A silver pen, usually aligned perfectly with a notepad on the bedside table, was now angled slightly to the left. A book on military strategy that she had dusted and placed back on its shelf yesterday was now protruding by 1/4 of an inch. Tiny, insignificant details. Things a paralyzed man couldn't possibly have touched. Lena told herself it was Mr. Cho, or one of the maids, their movements hurried and careless. She rationalized it away, because the alternative was unthinkable. The house, once a familiar, lonely sanctuary, began to feel different, its shadows deeper, its silence more active. The nights were the worst. A floorboard would creak upstairs in the deserted family wing. A faint click, like a latch settling, would echo down the hall. Each time, her heart would hammer against her ribs, and she would lie in her small staff quarters bed, straining to hear, convincing herself it was just the old mansion breathing around her. The external world occasionally bled through in the form of Mr. Cho's tense phone calls, which he always took in the hallway, his voice a low, urgent growl. She would catch phrases, names. The Kim Syndicate is getting bold. Secure the perimeter. The words painted a picture of a danger she was deliberately shielded from, a world of power and violence that existed just beyond the mansion's wrought iron gates. The tension was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of her routine. She found herself talking to Minjun more, her usual one-sided chatter becoming more like a confession. "Sometimes I think I'm losing my mind in this big, quiet house," she whispered one afternoon, while cleaning a smudge from the arm of his wheelchair. And then it happened. She dropped a small bottle of antiseptic solution, and it rolled under the edge of his chair. With a sigh, she knelt, reaching for it. Her head was low, her eyes level with the intricate machinery of the custom wheelchair. As her fingers brushed against the bottle, she saw it. On the advanced joystick controller, a feature she was told was vestigial, his right forefinger, the one always curled loosely in his lap, twitched. It was a minuscule, almost imperceptible motion. A deliberate, downward press that lasted less than a second. Her breath caught in her throat. It was impossible. She froze, her gaze locked on his hand, which was now perfectly still again. Slowly, she looked up at his face. It was the same as always, blank, impassive, staring into nothing. And yet, she had seen it. A single, silent message in a language she was never supposed to understand. Lena felt the world tilt on its axis. The tiny movement had shattered the foundation of her reality, the one she had carefully constructed over 15 years. For the rest of the day, she moved through her duties in a daze, her hands trembling as she served Minjun his meal, her voice unsteady as she read an article about global economics. She watched him. Every breath, every blink, every shadow that crossed his face was now a potential clue. Was he aware? Had he always been aware? Was her entire life here, her quiet confessions, her moments of lonely vulnerability, all a performance for an audience of one? The man she pitied was a stranger. The patient she cared for was a lie. The sheer scale of the deception was dizzying. That night, the external threat she had only heard in whispers crashed into their insulated world. An alarm blared through the mansion, a piercing shriek that was immediately followed by the deafening clang of steel shutters slamming down over every window. Music. The house was plunged into an artificial twilight, the only light coming from the emergency fixtures that cast long, menacing shadows down the marble hallways. Mr. Cho burst into the room, his face pale and grim, a phone pressed to his ear. "Lockdown," he snapped at Lena, not bothering with pleasantries. "The Kims have breached the outer wall. Stay in this wing. Do not open this door for anyone." He was gone as quickly as he appeared, leaving Lena with the thunderous pounding of her own heart and the silent man in the wheelchair. She was trapped. Trapped not just by the physical lockdown, but by the terrifying new knowledge she held. The silence in the room was no longer peaceful. It was heavy, suffocating, a living thing coiling between them. She backed away from Minjun's chair, her eyes wide, until her back hit the cold wall. She had to care for him, had to maintain the routine, but now it felt like a dangerous dance. A dance with a man who held all the cards, a man who had feigned total helplessness for more than a decade. The air was thick with unspoken questions. What did he want? Why the elaborate charade? The power dynamic had been inverted in a single, terrifying instant. She was no longer the caregiver. She was the prisoner, locked in a cage with a predator who had been pretending to be asleep. 10:47 p.m. The house was a tomb, the silence broken only by the hum of the backup generator. Lena paced the length of the suite, the soft soles of her nurse's shoes making no sound on the thick rug. Every time she looked at Minjun, she expected his head to turn, his lips to move. But he remained a perfect statue of infirmity, a masterpiece of deception. And she realized, with a fresh wave of horror, that she was part of his disguise. Her presence, her years of devoted, public care, was the most convincing part of his lie. The hours of the lockdown stretched into a day, then two. The oppressive quiet of the sealed mansion became a pressure cooker for Lena's anxiety. Mr. Cho was a phantom, appearing only to deliver terse updates and trays of food, his face etched with a stress that spoke of a war being fought just outside their steel-plated sanctuary. Confined to the master suite and the adjoining library, Lena felt her world shrinking. On the second night, desperate for a distraction, a way to quiet the screaming questions in her own mind, she began to clean. It was a compulsion, a need to impose order on a world that had dissolved into chaos. Wiping down the vast mahogany bookshelves in the library, her fingers traced the spines of books on philosophy, history, and war. Her hand brushed against a decorative panel, and she felt it give, just slightly. A faint click. Her breath hitched. Driven by a desperate curiosity, she pressed again. A section of the bookshelf swung inward, revealing a dark, shallow cavity. Inside sat a single, leather-bound photo album and a thin file folder tied with a faded ribbon. Her hands shook as she lifted them out. This was a violation, a trespass into a past she had no right to see, but she couldn't stop herself. She sat on the floor, the emergency light casting a pale glow on the objects in her lap. She opened the folder first. It was filled with yellowed newspaper clippings. The headlines were stark. Kong family ambushed, heir apparent critically injured, rival syndicate suspected in brutal attack. The articles detailed the event from 15 years ago. A violent, targeted strike on Minjun's motorcade. His younger brother, a rising politician, was killed instantly. Minjun himself was reported to have sustained a catastrophic spinal and brain injury, leaving him in what doctors called a persistent vegetative state, the official story. The lie she had been living. Then she opened the photo album. The man in the pictures was someone she barely recognized. It was Minjun, but it was a Minjun who smiled, whose eyes were alive with warmth and intelligence. In several photos, he was with a beautiful woman with a kind smile and a little girl with bright, curious eyes. His daughter. His wife. There were pictures of him pushing the little girl on a swing, of the three of them on a beach, their faces alight with joy. He looked happy. He looked whole. He looked like a man who had everything. Lena stared at the images, a profound, aching sadness welling up inside her. This was what he had lost. This was the man who had disappeared 15 years ago. She finally understood. The silence, the paralysis, it wasn't a medical condition. It was a fortress. He had buried himself alive to protect something, or to wait for something, to hunt. Every moment of her service, every gentle touch, every one-sided conversation had been with this man, this grieving husband and father, this silent tactician biding his time. The knowledge was a physical weight, settling in her chest. She looked over at the doorway, where Minjun sat in his wheelchair, a still silhouette against the dim light. He had been listening to her for 15 years. He knew her loneliness, her quiet hopes, her fears. And she had known nothing of the inferno of loss and rage burning behind his silent eyes. The lockdown ended as abruptly as it began. Mr. Cho appeared, his suit disheveled, a deep exhaustion in his eyes. "It's over for now," was all he said. The steel shutters retracted with a groan, letting in the gray light of dawn. But the sense of peace was a fragile illusion. The breach, though repelled, had been a show of force, a promise of what was to come. Later that day, the promise was delivered. There was no alarm this time, just a sudden, chilling silence as the mansion's few remaining staff were swiftly neutralized. The double doors to the master suite were thrown open, and a man strode in, flanked by two imposing figures. He was older, his face a mask of cruel arrogance. Lena recognized him from the news clippings. Chairman Kim, the patriarch of the rival syndicate. He walked with the swagger of a man who believed he had already won. His eyes, cold and reptilian, swept the room and landed on the still figure in the wheelchair. Well, Kong Minjun, he said, his voice dripping with contempt. Still pretending to be a statue? After all these years? It's a pathetic sight. He circled the wheelchair like a shark, his gaze filled with a triumphant hatred. Then his eyes fell on Lena, who stood frozen by the window. He looked her up and down, a dismissive sneer twisting his lips. "And this is what you have left. A fat nurse to wipe your chin." The words were designed to humiliate, to strip away her humanity and reduce her to her function. He took a step toward her. "Tell me, is he worth the pittance they pay you? To care for a vegetable?" For 15 years, Lena had been invisible. She had been quiet. She had accepted her place. But something inside her snapped. The man he was mocking wasn't a vegetable. He was a man who had suffered an unimaginable loss, a man she had cared for, a man whose secrets she now shared, even if he didn't know it. A fierce, protective instinct she never knew she possessed surged through her. She stepped forward, deliberately placing herself between Chairman Kim and Minjun's wheelchair. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs, but her voice, when it came, was steady. "Leave him alone," Chairman Kim laughed, a short, ugly sound.
"Brave.
"Or just stupid." He gestured to one of his men. "Perhaps we should show her what happens to people who get in the way. Maybe if we hurt her, you'll remember how to make a sound." Kong, the threat hung in the air, thick and immediate. Lena stood her ground, her body trembling but her resolve firm. She was tired of being unseen. She was tired of being afraid. In that moment, as the thug started towards her, she looked at Minjun. His face was still a mask, but in the depths of his dark, unmoving eyes, she saw it. A flicker. A storm gathering. A cold, calculated rage that promised retribution. A tight, visceral thought. Not her own, but felt as clearly as a shout in the silent room. Rage. Cold. A predator's stillness. Not her. The king on the board was about to make his move. The thug took a lazy step forward, a cruel grin spreading across his face, his knuckles cracking as he flexed his hands. Lena's blood ran cold. She could feel Chairman Kim's malevolent gaze on her, enjoying her terror, waiting for the scream that would finally break Minjun's legendary composure. She braced herself for the impact, a silent prayer forming on her lips. But the blow never landed. A sudden, violent blur of motion erupted from the hallway. Mr. Cho, his face a mask of cold fury, appeared as if from nowhere, moving with a speed and brutality that seemed impossible for the usually reserved handler. He disabled the first man with a series of precise, devastating strikes, his movements economical and deadly. Two more of Minjun's loyal security staff, dressed in dark suits, materialized behind him, their efficiency turning the confrontation into a swift, brutal ballet of force. They subdued Kim's men with a chilling professionalism that spoke of years of training for this exact kind of moment. It was over in less than 10 seconds. Chairman Kim watched, his arrogance melting into stunned disbelief, then curdling into pure rage. He hadn't been defeated. He had been outmaneuvered in his own moment of triumph. His eyes darted to Minjun, who hadn't moved a muscle, his expression still utterly vacant. The perfect statue. It was then Kim understood. The lockdown, the breach, it had all been a test, a baited trap, and he had walked right into it. He had shown his hand, and Minjun had confirmed the loyalty and readiness of his inner circle. Kim's face contorted, and he pointed a trembling finger, not at Minjun, but at Lena. "Get rid of her," he snarled at Mr. Cho, his voice venomous. "If I ever see her again, I will not be so restrained. This is your only warning." He turned and stormed out, his remaining men dragging their subdued comrades with them. The immediate danger was gone, but a new, colder dread settled over Lena. She looked at Mr. Cho, whose face was once again an impassive mask, though she could see a flicker of something, regret, in his eyes. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible bow in Minjun's direction before turning to her. "You have 1 hour to pack your things," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "A car will be waiting." The words hit her harder than any physical blow.
"What? No."
"You can't." She looked desperately at Minjun, pleading with her eyes for him to do something to stop this.
But he just sat there, silent,
unmoving, paralyzed. It was the cruelest cut of all. After everything, after seeing the man behind the mask, she was being thrown away. She was nothing more than a piece on the board, and her sacrifice was required. The despair was a physical weight, crushing the air from her lungs. She had been exposed, blamed, and was now being exiled. She was invisible all over again. Lena found herself in a small, third-floor apartment in a part of the city that smelled of wet asphalt and fried food. The room was a universe away from the silent, marble halls of the Kong estate. Here, the silence was thin, easily pierced by the wail of distant sirens and the rumble of the elevated train. She had been given a generous severance package, delivered by Mr. Cho in a thick envelope, his final words to her a curt, "Stay safe. Do not try to make contact." It was a gilded cage of a different kind. For days, she drifted in a fog of disbelief and a profound, hollow loneliness. She would sit on the lumpy sofa, staring at the water-stained ceiling, replaying the confrontation in her mind. Had she been a fool? Had she misread everything? The flicker in his eyes, the twitch of his finger. Maybe it had all been a product of her own desperate need to believe there was more to her life than just a routine. The world outside her window felt alien. She was untethered, a ghost haunting a life that was no longer hers. Every creak of the floorboards in the apartment above sent a jolt of fear through her. She felt hunted, watched. The feeling of being unseen, once a familiar cloak of her profession, was now a terrifying vulnerability. She was just a woman alone, who knew a secret that could get her killed. The routine that had once been her prison now seemed like a lost paradise. She missed the weight of the silver spoon in her hand, the specific scent of the library's old books, the quiet rhythm of Minjun's breathing in the still room. She missed the man she thought she knew, and she mourned the man she had just discovered. The separation was a physical ache, a phantom limb of a life that had been amputated. She found herself talking to him, as if he were there. Was any of it real? She whispered into the empty room one night, tears tracing hot paths down her cheeks. Did you see me at all? The city noise was her only answer. Meanwhile, miles away, in the cold, opulent suite, the scent of her lemon-scented cleaning polish was fading. The room felt sterile, empty. Minjun sat by the window, his gaze fixed on the city lights he could see beyond the garden walls. A missing piece. A strategic liability he had been forced to remove from the board. But as he methodically planned his final campaign against the Kim Syndicate, a new variable had entered the equation, an unwelcome, dangerous emotion that felt like a splinter of glass in his heart. Her name was Lena, and he had to get her back. A week after her dismissal, there was a sharp, authoritative knock on her apartment door. Lena's heart leaped into her throat. She froze, her mind racing. It was them. The Kims had found her. She held her breath, listening. The knock came again, louder this time, followed by a familiar, low voice. Lena SSI. It's Han-Sol Cho. Please open the door. You are not in danger. Her fear was instantly replaced by a wave of confusion and anger.
Mr. Cho.
The man who had coldly thrown her out. With trembling hands, she unlocked the door, opening it only a crack. He stood in the dimly lit hallway, looking out of place in his perfectly tailored suit. His face was etched with a deep weariness, but his expression was serious, urgent. We need you to come with me, he said, his voice quiet. Why? She asked, her voice tight with resentment. So you can throw me away again when I become inconvenient. Mr. Cho's impassive facade cracked for a moment. A flicker of genuine remorse crossed his features. That was not my choice. It was a necessary move to ensure your safety. Chairman Kim would have targeted you immediately. We had to make him believe you were discarded, that you meant nothing. His words chipped away at her anger, leaving a raw, vulnerable hope. And now, she whispered, now things have changed. He is asking for you, The word hung in the air, electric with meaning. It wasn't a summons from a distant, powerful entity. It was a personal request. A part of her screamed to slam the door, to run, and never look back. But a deeper part, the part that had seen the truth in Minjun's eyes, knew she had to go. She had to have answers. The car ride was silent. The windows tinted black, obscuring their path through the city. They didn't return to the main estate, but to a discreet, modern penthouse overlooking the Han River. Mr. Cho led her into a large, sparsely furnished living room. And there he was. He was not in his wheelchair. He was standing by the floor-to-ceiling windows, dressed in simple black trousers and a gray cashmere sweater, his back to her as he watched the city below. He was taller than she had imagined, his posture radiating a quiet, coiled power. He turned slowly, and for the first time, she saw him not as a patient, but as the man he truly was. His face, no longer a blank mask, was carved with the lines of old grief and new purpose. His eyes, clear and fiercely intelligent, met hers. Thank you for coming, Lena, he said. His voice was deeper than she had ever imagined, a low, steady baritone that held the gravel of long disuse. The sound of it, after 15 years of silence, was so shocking she felt her knees weaken. I owe you an explanation. And an apology. He gestured to a simple sofa and she sat, feeling as if she were in a dream. He remained standing, a respectful distance away, his presence filling the room. 15 years ago, he began, his voice calm and measured. Chairman Kim arranged the ambush that you read about. It wasn't meant to injure me. It was meant to eliminate my brother and my family. His face tightened, a shadow of an unbearable pain passing over his features. My wife, Hygiene, and my daughter, Minnie, were in the car with my brother. They were all killed. I was the only survivor. Lena felt a wave of nausea. The smiling woman and bright-eyed little girl from the photographs. The reality of it was so much more brutal than the newspaper clippings had suggested. The doctor said the trauma had locked me in a vegetative state. At first, it was real. But after a few months, I woke up, alone in a hospital bed. And I heard them talking. The Kims had consolidated power. Everyone believed I was gone, a living ghost. He paced slowly, his movements fluid, controlled. So, I made a choice. I would stay a ghost. I learned to control every muscle, every reflex. I made my body a prison to build a weapon of patience. From that chair, I could listen. I could watch. Mr. Cho was my eyes and ears. We rebuilt my organization from the inside out, silently, while our enemies grew complacent. Believing their only threat was a man who couldn't even feed himself, he stopped and looked directly at her, his gaze intense, penetrating. And then you came. You were kind and you were diligent. You talked to me. For 15 years, you told me about your life, your dreams, your loneliness. You never treated me like an object. You treated me like a person. You were the only window I had to a world I thought I had lost forever. The confession was overwhelming. He had heard everything. Every frustrated sigh. Every whispered hope. She wasn't just his nurse. She had been his companion, his unwitting confidant. I am sorry for the deception, he said, his voice softening. And I am sorry for what you were put through. When Kim threatened you, it was the first time in 15 years I almost broke my silence. Putting you out was the hardest thing I've ever had to do, but it was the only way to keep you alive. He took a step closer, his eyes holding hers. Now, Kim is making his final move. He's overconfident. I have spent years gathering every piece of evidence, every secret transaction, every betrayal. I am ready to dismantle his empire from the foundation up. But I found I could not do it without seeing you one last time. Without telling you the truth, the sincerity in his voice was undeniable. The validation, the feeling of being truly seen for the first time, was a powerful, dizzying wave. The question was, what came next? The final phase of his plan was a masterpiece of strategic cruelty, executed with the precision of a surgeon. Min-jun didn't need guns or an army. His weapon was information, wielded with a patience honed over 15 years of silence. He sat not in a wheelchair, but at a large, slate-gray desk dominated by a bank of monitors. Lena stood by his side, a cup of tea in her hands, her presence a silent, steady anchor in the storm he was about to unleash. Chairman Kim's entire operation is built on a network of corrupt politicians and international investors, Min-jun explained, his voice a low hum of controlled intensity. They believe their money is protected by layers of shell corporations and offshore accounts. What they don't know is that I control the central node of their encrypted financial network. I have for the last 7 years. He pointed to a screen filled with cascading lines of code. This is his heart. And I am about to stop it. He looked at Lena, a question in his eyes. He wasn't asking for permission, but for participation. A shared conclusion. He built an empire on the graves of your family, she said, her voice quiet but firm. He deserves to lose everything. That was all the confirmation he needed. The first move was a simple email sent from a ghost server to the top shareholders of Kim's legitimate front company, a massive tech conglomerate. The email contained irrefutable proof of embezzlement on a catastrophic scale, implicating Kim's eldest son. Panic would rip through the stock market within minutes. The second move was a data transfer. With a few keystrokes, Min-jun released years of evidence, transaction logs, recorded conversations, photographic evidence, to a consortium of international journalists and law enforcement agencies he had cultivated through intermediaries. The evidence didn't just incriminate Kim, it implicated every powerful figure who had enabled him. The third and final move was the most personal. Min-jun initiated a video call. On the screen, Chairman Kim's face appeared, his expression smug as he sat in his opulent office. To what do I owe this surprise?
Kim sneered.
And then Min-jun spoke, his voice calm, deadly, and unmistakable. You're a man who enjoys taking things, Kim. So I thought you should be awake to feel this. He tilted his own webcam down to show his hands, typing on the keyboard, and then back up to his face. Kim's jaw went slack, his face draining of all color. The ghost was real. My family is gone because of you, Min-jun continued, his voice dropping to a near whisper. So, I am taking yours, not their lives. I'm not you. I'm taking their legacy. Your name. Your money. By the time the sun rises, the name Kim will be synonymous with disgrace. You will be penniless. Your allies will be your accusers. And you'll spend what is left of your miserable life in a concrete box. Remembering this conversation on the screen, Kim's phone began to ring, then his desk line, a cacophony of incoming ruin. His empire was crumbling in real time, and Min-jun made him watch every second of it. Lena watched Min-jun, not the strategist or the avenger, but the man. When it was over, when the final call was made and the digital bombs had all detonated, he closed his laptop. He leaned back in his chair and closed his eyes, the tension of 15 years draining from him in a single, shuddering breath. He had won. The war was over. He opened his eyes and looked at Lena, and in his gaze, she saw not triumph, but a vast, empty landscape of grief. He had his justice, but it would never bring them back. He reached across the desk and, for the first time, took her hand. His touch was warm, real, and in that simple connection, a new chapter began, not of revenge, but of healing. The epilogue of their story was written not in a cold, marble mansion, but in a small, whitewashed house on the coast of Jeju Island. The windows were thrown open to the sea, and the scent of salt and wild camellias drifted in on the breeze. The silence here was different. It was a comfortable, peaceful quiet, filled with the gentle sounds of waves and the rustle of leaves, not the oppressive, watchful silence of Min-jun's former life. They had left Seoul behind, along with the ghosts of the Kong and Kim dynasties. The news of Chairman Kim's spectacular fall from grace and subsequent arrest had dominated the headlines for weeks, but it felt like a story about other people. Min-jun was no longer Kong Min-jun, the feared strategist. He was just Min-jun, a man learning to live in the light again. He spent his days walking the black sand beaches, the wind whipping through his hair, his face slowly losing the tight, controlled mask he had worn for so long. Lena was no longer just a nurse. She was a partner, a confidant, a woman who had chosen to stand by a man who had been to hell and back. Their routines were simple, a quiet dance of healing. She would read to him in the evenings, not from newspapers, but from novels, their stories weaving a new tapestry of shared experience. He would cook for her, his movements in the kitchen surprisingly adept, a quiet expression of care that said more than words ever could. He still had nightmares. Sometimes he would wake up, his breathing ragged, the names of his wife and daughter on his lips. Lena would simply hold his hand, her presence a steady anchor in the dark, until the storm passed. She was the living proof that a second chance was possible, that redemption could be found not in revenge, but in the quiet courage of choosing love. One afternoon, they were sitting on the porch, watching the sun dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. He had been quiet for a long time, his hand resting over hers on the weathered wooden armrest. She had learned to read his silences, and this one was not filled with sadness, but with a gentle, profound sense of peace. He turned to her, his dark eyes clear and full of a tenderness she had once only dreamed of seeing. For 15 years, you took care of a broken man, he said, his voice soft against the sound of the waves. You saw a person where everyone else saw a ghost. You saved my life, Lena. Not from my enemies, but from myself. She felt tears well in her eyes, but she did not look away. He brought her hand to his lips and kissed her knuckles gently. I can't get back the years I lost. I can't build a new empire. I don't want to. All I want to build is a life. With you, he looked out at the endless ocean, then back at her, his expression holding the weight of a decade and a half of unspoken gratitude. Let's get married. The words were not a question, but a statement. A quiet, certain, and hopeful beginning. It was the final, most important move from the man who had mastered the art of waiting, a choice to build a future not on the ashes of the past, but on the steady ground of a love that had been strong enough to break the silence.